Hello, welcome to episode 5 of Snippit Sports Science Podcast. This is Jared Coleman-Stark with Chris Gavilio today, looking at an article from the researchers at University of Tokyo Graduate School of Frontier Sciences. They've done an article on the effects of bench press training with blood flow restriction, specifically on chest muscle hypertrophy. The reason we're looking at chest muscle hypertrophy is previously people have thought that blood flow restriction only affects the distal part of the limb. Is that true, Chris?
That's what a lot of research initially looked at, was just that distal part. But also I just looked at it as a really good applied study. Like most studies look at single joint type movements, whereas this is it's an applied double joint. It's bench press.
Yep.
And that's what really drew me to the study in the first place.
So what was their rationale for beginning it?
So they talk about all those age-related skeletal muscle loss type issues with aging populations, sarcopenia. As people get older, the ability to train in an aging population is quite difficult because we need a certain stimulus of the muscle to actually get positive changes. As we know, you just can't do that in that aging population. So this is where BFR, or blood flow restriction training, works really well. You look back in literature, loads as low as 20% of 1RM have been known to increase muscle hypertrophy and strength. So they've applied this study to, although a young population, a really nice applied exercise in the exercise of bench press.
A really interesting thing with targeting an elderly population with blood flow restriction training is that blood flow restriction actually has the ability to grow type 1 fibers as opposed to just type 2 fibers. That's what we see with sarcopenia, is you're losing all your type 2 fiber, but your type 1 fiber remains. So if we're able to grow type 1 fiber, that's an unprecedented level of sarcopenia protection.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what the article doesn't go into also, there's also markers of increased bone reformation, assisting in also tendinopathies as well. And they're the little incidental positive off spins from using BFR.
Yeah, I think those are definitely, those have been maybe not neglected topics in blood flow restriction training. It's something that people will come around to now that there's so much literature behind muscle and strength. So you were saying that the population was actually a young population. Can you tell us a little bit more about the subjects?
So 10 males, average between 23 to 38. Going a little bit deeper into it, their body weight was around 61 to 73 kilos, and their bench press 1RM was 50 to 66 kilos. So they bench pressed less than 1 times body weight. But when you look into it, they didn't actually have a history of strength or regular gym training or strength training, but they were fit. So in terms of the application of this into age-related sarcopenia, we could apply that the elderly population may not be training quite regularly, but they're actually a fit young group.
Right, and obviously you want to be defending against sarcopenia as early as possible. And because we don't have the data for that, there may be unprecedented benefits from being a young person who trains their entire life with blood flow restriction training, and then once they become an elderly person, how much more protected would they be?
Yeah, definitely. And when you actually dig a little deeper into the study, when you start lifting weights, you're always quite sore, and it's hard to see those gains initially. So when you actually look at the study and the results that they found, it's actually not a bad way of introducing someone into strength training. The frequency is really high, but the load is really low. So I'm assuming that, although not reported, that I would assume that the DOMs would be quite low in this, as opposed to the first time you ever do strength training, usually sore for days, if not weeks, because each session, it takes 3 days to recover. You do your next session, you get sore from that until, several weeks, in a couple of months where you're actually comfortable in lifting weights.
Yeah, absolutely. They're going at 30% 1RM here, so very low mechanical load, very little muscle damage, very little DOMs afterwards.
Yeah, definitely. So what they actually did in the study, it was a 2-week long study. They bench pressed twice a day for 6 days a week, so they had 1 day off. What the session was is their first set was 30 reps, and then they did 3 sets of 15 after that with 30 seconds rest in between sets. So at 30% of 1RM, I think we're looking around a 20 kilo load, which in strength and conditioning world is quite light.
The bar,
basically.
the lowest weight that you can use.
Yeah. The pressures that they used were between 100 to 160 millimeters of mercury. The thickness of the cuff wasn't reported, and nor was it continuous or intermittent. That wasn't reported either. However, I would assume that with 30 seconds rest between sets, that it'd be a continuous pressure. The session wouldn't have taken very long to complete. So the stimulus is actually really quite short, which is another positive in this study. The measurements that they took was a bench press 1 RM. How much can you do in one repetition? Muscle size. They used muscle thickness as an indication of increase in size of the muscle because it actually correlates quite strongly to muscle cross-sectional area. So they were your two main ones. There was actually a couple of bloods with growth hormone, insulin growth factor 1, insulin growth factor binding protein 3, and also markers of muscle damage in creatine phosphokinase and myoglobin.
Well, it's pretty extensive.
Yeah, definitely. I think when you look at literature, it's been known to show, increases in acute levels of anabolic hormones, which is another benefit of BFR.
Yeah, it's just nice that they've been comprehensive with those measures. For example, if you're just looking at creatine kinase and not looking at myoglobin, you have an incomplete picture of what the actual muscle damage occurred.
Yeah, exactly right.
So what did they find with those measures?
All their pre-measures, there was no differences between the groups, and there was no change in the body weight following the training. However, the post-measures, what they found is in the muscle thickness, the triceps increased around 8% and in the pecs around 16%. So that was in the BFR group. There was no significant changes in the control group. So obviously the stimulus just wasn't enough to elicit any change in muscle thickness or cross-sectional area.
Also sounds like they weren't eating for it.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's something that, when you're training, you need to eat to help the muscles recover and repair and grow.
So it sounds like they may have had improvements in body composition, which I don't believe that they measured body composition. No. So it looks like they may have had a bit of improvement in body composition based on that data, but that you wouldn't actually be able to grow without gaining weight.
Yeah, definitely. And, in terms of improvement in strength, the BFR group improved 6%, and the control group, where they used no BFR, was actually lost strength, minus 2%, and no significant change in hormones, which is probably something that we thought, or they thought they probably would have seen, but didn't observe. But I think the big thing there is they actually saw an improvement in strength and also in muscle size as well.
Yeah, benching with the barbell, no plates on the sides of it. We wouldn't really expect that otherwise.
No, that's pretty good gains, and it shows that if you didn't have the BFR, that's just not enough stimulus. We talk about the amount of stress needed. That's not enough mechanical stress or load to elicit any kind of positive change.
So what did the researchers then pull out of that information?
Well, obviously BFR is quite a positive addition to training. One thing that they looked at was that the data wasn't presented, but they actually had an increase in EMG activity. They didn't show the data, but they thought that the contraction intensity was greater in that BFR group. Hence, that might have been the results in the improvement in strength and the size, but not enough change in the hormones. So the stimulus wasn't great enough.
Right.
To get that acute change.
Right. You'd want a little bit bigger lifting to be getting larger systemic effects.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Definitely.
But they are seeing that the chest actually hypertrophy.
Yeah, and that was something that I think they wanted to show because the point you brought up earlier about typically the effects which are distal to show that the chest actually increased. And I do know there's a paper by Cook et al. Where they actually used the cuffs on the thigh and actually had improvements in upper body strength. So there's some kind of systemic effect which actually may be a positive benefit, although their loads were a lot higher at 70% of RM as opposed to this.
So I would say, though, that those distal effects, the proximal effects, and the systemic effects are all three different things. So you're talking about the systemic effects from lifting with the legs. You get a full systemic effect, but then there's also a difference between the effects that, say, if you have the cuffs around the arm, what's going to happen to the triceps versus the chest versus the thigh. There'll be different mechanisms happening in each of those. Did they discuss at all what might be specifically the proximal but non-systemic effects? No, because what I've previously seen about that is that it's actually that the triceps fatigues out due to the cuff, and then the chest has to be doing more work. That's one of the mechanisms that I've heard for that.
Just the thinking here, I should wonder if it's also just the exercise selection. You look at a squat, for example, and most lower body studies, they'll be put on the leg and they're actually like a quad dominant exercise. So that's where you'll feel it. You won't necessarily feel it in your glutes. Whereas a bench press, although it is triceps, it's actually chest as well. So you have a large activation. Whereas if you then say you did a bicep curl, I don't think we would have seen, or they would have seen changes in chest. So they were quite clever in terms of saying they haven't seen anything proximal, but I think the actual exercise they chose actually helped elicit that activation, which they actually saw through EMG, to actually get that change in muscle size and strength. So that was what was able to give them the stimulus.
And I mean, we'll go way over time if we get into this too much. I think one big thing that we see there is, you mentioned the quad dominant exercise, is that blood flow restriction training is going to have massively different effects depending on what muscle you're using it on. Essentially, I think it's quite specific to fiber type, actually, because your type 1 fiber is much more fatigue resistant. It's much more resistant to deoxygenation. So if you have more your type 2 dominant fibers, quads, pecs, triceps, I mean, the pecs and the triceps, they're made to be throwing, so it's very type 2 dominant. And that type of fiber is very fatigue sensitive. It's very deoxygenation sensitive. So when you're using your cuffs on type 2 fibers, it's going to be much more fatiguing.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Chris. And thank you, listeners. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our website at snippetscience.com or follow us on Twitter at snippetscience. Thank you.